Hello, BookTube. I'm Peg, and welcome to my channel. Well, I have finished the tomes that I had chosen to read for the Tome Topple challenge, and I'm going to talk about them here and wrap them up so I can get to reading something else. They were pretty long, but I'm glad I did it, and I learned a lot. And I'll tell you a little bit of the setup. I had been thinking and talking a lot lately about neo-Victorian tomes and novels, which are written about the Victorian age, but written in the modern day. And those have become quite popular today, and they do all seem to be tomes. But first of all, I chose three of the best known of those to read, and ones I've really wanted to read for a long time. But before I read those, I decided to read an actual Victorian novel to be able to compare the difference in the way they were written. And so I chose The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope. It was kind of a buddy read on with Steve Donahue. I'm sure he's read it, but I'm not sure who else was in it. But I'm calling it a buddy read. Anyway, this took place in 1870s London, which is near Trollope's the end of his life, and one of the later ones he wrote. And it's not quite the cozy Victorian style that some of the series had, the Barchester Chronicles and the Palliser series, but it's very well done, and it's a social satire about the times and the way things were done in those times, and has meaning today, actually. But some of the things I noticed about it were there was a definite class system. There was the upper class, and it seemed like not much middle class, and then the servant class, and most of the books that Trollope has written has been about the upper class or people that were trying to get into the upper class. Anyway, this deals with a man that comes to live in London named Melmont, Augustus Melmont, who appears to be very wealthy, but he's a little strange. It's a question about whether he's a foreigner or whatever, but he throws a big party and people aren't going to question that. So at the very start, they go to, it has a lot of the characters that will turn up later going to his party. And he has a lovely, beautiful daughter, which all the guys are trying to marry. This is another thing that seems to be prevalent in Victorian novels, is that people are not expected to marry for love. They're encouraged to marry somebody who has more money than their own family does, or in some way more prestige. And I've seen that in a lot of Victorian novels where they're kind of pressed into marriage. Some other things I noticed different was that it's told from the third person point of view, which my neofiction novels are all told from one person's point of view, and it goes much into their feelings. So when it's from the third person point of view, you don't get as many personal feelings. And I don't know, maybe they just didn't talk about feelings back in those days. I don't think they were as psychologically minded as we are, but you got more of an exterior view of people. But you still were able to tell what the author thought of them. I mean, people it seemed like, were either good or bad. There was really no in between, even if they were a little bad. If they were good at heart, that was all right. And usually the bad guy gets his due in the end in these. Let's see. As I said, the lower class, almost everybody seemed to have maids and footmen and lots of people, and they're not really mentioned at all in this book and in other Victorian stories I've noticed. And I think they were just not considered, I don't know, people or interesting back then. This was the class system. Now we've come to think very differently. When the first show I'm aware of was called Upstairs Downstairs, where we became just as interested in those that lived downstairs as those that lived upstairs, and realized they had a life and a story too. And Downton Abbey recently has done the same thing. We were just as involved with the servants' story as the people that they served. So that's one big difference that I noticed. Still, I enjoyed reading it, and it definitely had a distinct tone and flavor, and I got an idea of what actual Victorian writing feels like. Okay, let's talk about the neo-fiction that I read and how it differs. The first one I read was called Crimson Petal and the White by Michael Faber. Now this is quite famous. All these are well known and were the top of the list for neo-Victorian novels that I read several lists. And this one deals with a prostitute in a brothel named Sugar, and very smart girl, and somehow knows how to read, and is able to rise through society with the help of a gentleman and etc. But one of the big differences, I'm sure nobody in Victorian literature really talks much about prostitutes, though they were quite prevalent, I'm sure. And this one not only talks about them, but is very graphic. And the brothel she lives in, you learn a lot about how things are done there, and completely different tone and subject than a true Victorian novel would have. It's very well researched. I mean, we got to know what the streets were like and what they ate and everything. So this was very well done, and with a tremendous surprise ending. I'm not even going to talk about it. You just really need to read it for that. Okay, next I read Fingersmith by Sarah Waters, and she is quite well known and has written quite a few neo-Victorian novels, and some have been on prize lists. Actually, I think Fingersmith might have won something. I should have looked it up. But anyway, this is told through the eyes of a young woman who is in the first. She's taken away for this crooked ploy that's going to happen. She lives in the slums with a group of people who are fingersmiths, and that means petty thieves, mainly pickpockets, and that's how they make their living and live. And she gets involved with this group, or this man actually, who has this plan to take some money from a very rich woman through very distinct means. But first of all, the Sue, who's the main character in it, telling the story, becomes a lady's maid for this woman that they're going to end up bilking in trying to get her money. So again, that seen through that eyes and her feelings really is so much different than you'd ever see in a Victorian novel itself. And there are lots of interesting plot twists in this, and a really surprise ending. So I don't know, maybe that's a characteristic of neo-fiction novels, because all of these had it. I will also say that something that it had that a Victorian novel would never have is some lesbian scenes. So as I said, these are written from a modern viewpoint, but it looks at Victorianism, and probably we're learning more about what happened, what the Victorian world was really like, than by reading actual Victorian novels. Okay, last was my series that I read. You're supposed to read a tome that's part of the series, and I ended up, this was the first one, The Meaning of Night, and it was pretty good, but I really liked the way that he wrote. So I finished it, and that sort of finished my tomes. But the one I want to talk about is the second one in the series, which I've also started, and The Glass of Time. And it's also told through the eyes of a young woman who becomes a lady's maid and as part of a scheme to defraud her, and what ends up happening. And this one is just full of wonderful atmosphere, and there's lost letters and secret inheritance in a big old Victorian house with spooky corners. And I just really love this one. I think he is does more with the actual atmosphere of the and the setting than any of them do. And when to sum up, I would say that the difference between Victorian and neo-Victorian is that the Victorian novel doesn't is more about the story, the plot. It doesn't spend a lot of time giving the world building and giving the setting, because they assume that their readers already know what Victorian life is like. Whereas these others have researched, and they're all really well researched and well written, and just give more of a distinct flavor of Victorian times. So let me know if you've read any of these and liked them. And I'm through with tomes for a while. Okay, bye.